The White Helmets are operating a missile warning system that they say is designed to protect civilians from Syrian and Russian airstrikes. But is this technology benefiting jihadist groups instead? RT's Dan Cohen has that story.
A new technology is said to be saving lives in al-Qaeda-controlled Idlib province, but it's not exactly clear whose lives are being saved. It's called the Sentry system, and it's operated by the White Helmets with a network of spotters on the ground. They provide information about Russian and Syrian aircraft through social media and walkie-talkies, and the Sentry system alerts users through sirens and apps like Facebook and Telegram. The system is funded by the US, UK, Canadian, and Dutch governments. It was designed by a group of Americans, a former State Department official, a one-time investment banker, and a former Lockheed Martin engineer. So it might not be surprising that the system doesn't monitor US airstrikes in other parts of Syria, and it's not deployed in Iraq or Afghanistan. But Idlib province in northern Syria is now home to tens of thousands of battle-hardened militants from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, an umbrella group that includes al-Qaeda and other jihadist groups, all of them dedicated to eliminating minority religious sects and establishing an Islamic State. And the White Helmets who operate the Sentry system have been filmed partaking in summary executions alongside al-Qaeda members. Back in 2015, these White Helmets celebrated with al-Qaeda after Idlib fell from government control. This image from Sentry's website shows the White Helmets next to the inscription of Kataib al-Sunni, or the Sunni Brigade, one of the many jihadist groups operating in Idlib. So while the Syrian army is preparing to liberate Idlib, U.S. government-funded technology very well may be interfering in that effort. Reporting in Washington, Dan Cohen, RT.
Rebel fighters from the Free Syrian Army who oppose the government of Bashar al-Assad are preparing for battle in the province of Idlib, the last remaining militant and terrorist stronghold in Syria. That's as US President Donald Trump urges Russia and Iran to call off liberation efforts in the region. Well, RT's Daniel Hawkins joins me in the studio with more on the situation there. Daniel, thanks for coming in. It looks like the rebels are preparing for war.
Yeah, it certainly does. Idlib's, of course, controlled by a whole patchwork of rebel and terrorist group. It's the last rebel terrorist stronghold in Syria. The other areas have largely been liberated. The fighters in that area have made it clear that they will fight, that they will repel any offensive by Damascus to retake the area. This is what they had to say.
We're getting ready to face the violent Russian-Iranian campaign, hand in hand with our revolutionary brothers. We're preparing our people to be determined on the front and to stand up to the offensive.
We are preparing for any actions by the regime. We train with all types of weapons.
Now, some of the rebels there are the so-called moderate opposition, which, of course, have existed, do exist. The protests obviously began peacefully. But the key problem, of course, in Idlib is the driving force, the main fighting force there are Tahrir al-Sham, former Jabhat al-Nusra. This is an organization that is Salafist. They have committed many acts of barbarism and are recognized indeed as terrorists by both the US and Russia, something they can agree on. Of many things they do disagree on. They have made it clear that there will be no surrender, no negotiation with Damascus, and anybody who negotiates, lays down their arms or even tries to leave will be seen as traitors and will suffer the consequences. And Staffan de Mistura, the UN negotiator, has made clear this group is not a minority in Idlib. There are a large number of these foreign fighters that are present in that province.
Idlib has another fact, and we have to recognize it, an extremely high concentration of foreign fighters. The estimates of the Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, whatever name they want to call themselves, is more or less around 10,000 of them.
With so many foreign Salafist fighters in the area who are refusing to leave, to surrender, to negotiate, it does seem increasingly likely a military solution to that specific area is inevitable. Damascus has been pulling up forces there, with other forces present, of course, as well. Turkish military advisors, American military advisors, well, in the region. It does seem increasingly likely that shots will be fired.
So what's the view from Washington when it comes to this battle for Idlib?
Well, I mean, Trump has tweeted recently. He's warned Assad against what he described as a reckless attack on Idlib. He's warned Russia and Iran to stay away, to stay clear and not get involved. The Russian foreign minister, however, has called on some sort of cooperation here to separate those terrorists from moderate armed opposition. This is what he had to say.
President Bashar al-Assad of Syria must not recklessly attack Idlib province. The Russians and Iranians would be making a grave humanitarian mistake to take part in this potential human tragedy. Hundreds of thousands of people could be killed. Don't let that happen.
We are now doing all we can, along with our Turkish and Iranian colleagues and the Syrian government, to separate the armed opposition from the terrorists in the area, to ensure that civilian lives are spared in any military operation.
We have had similar calls from Moscow before, and indeed there have been agreements in other parts of Syria where rebels and terrorists have been separated, and terrorists, in exchange for allowing civilians to leave, to lay down, for them to lay down their heavy weaponry, have been bussed into Idlib, hence the concentration of Salafist fighters in that area. Every time, though, Washington has been quite reluctant to do this. This may be down to a number of factors, perhaps because they're closely intertwined through alliances, military alliances on the battlefield. Damascus claims a moderate opposition doesn't even exist. There is various takes on why this has happened. The Syrian government has made it clear they're going to retake Idlib. They're going to get rid of the terrorists in that area, describing it as a tumor of growth that needs to be cut out. The terrorists have made it clear there will be no talks with Damascus. They will die there. They will die fighting. No negotiation at all. Now, the Iranian foreign minister has arrived in Damascus to meet Syrian officials as well. The Russian Reconciliation Center in Syria is involved in those talks as well. They will lay the groundwork for the next round of Syrian peace talks. They'll probably take place on Friday in Tehran, hopefully with some sort of solution as to how to make a breakthrough and avoid what could very sadly be a civilian bloodbath.
Indeed, all hopes are on those Friday talks. Thank you for those details. That's Daniel Hawkins. Well, RT spoke exclusively to the Syrian foreign minister about the fight against jihadists in his country.
There have been no secret meetings because in that case, a number of questions arise. What's the benefit for us from such encounters? Is the administration trustworthy? Does it really stick to its obligations under the concluded agreements? Absolutely not. The U.S. administration has demonstrated its blatant hostility towards Syria since 2011, when the crisis began, without any encounters or contacts. It has provided Jabhat al-Nusra with weapons. First of all, the international community should recognize that Idlib province is Syrian territory, and the Syrian government must regain full control of it. Secondly, as President Assad said, our priority is to liberate Idlib, either peacefully, which we prefer, or using the military. Thirdly, it is clear that Jabhat al-Nusra is listed as a terrorist organization by the United Nations. On this basis, I can say that if military action is considered necessary, it would be only to counter Jabhat al-Nusra. Those groups who are in favor of a settlement deal should voice their position and meet their commitments in terms of reconciliation. It's illegal. No one in Syria demanded such a presence, and the legitimate government in this country has a staunch stance towards such a presence. It treats it as illegal. The U.S. came to Syria to play a leading role in the final decision-making. And that role, doubtless, is hostile towards the interests of the Syrian people. That's why we call such a presence illegal. And we're fighting against such a presence. And as time goes by, it's the U.S. presence that's hindering conflict resolution.
Former longtime U.S. Congressman Ron Paul. Mr. Paul, thank you for taking the time to speak to us this hour. Do you think there's still a way for the situation in Idlib to be resolved peacefully?
Well, there certainly is. That doesn't mean that I think it's going to happen. But, you know, if people would just act wisely, this could be ended, because there's no reason it can't be. But expect the West, the United States, to back down. I don't think it's going to happen. And I think the pressure is so great on the people who want to confront Russia. It's all designed, you know, to satisfy Iran, and to go after Iran is an anti-Iranian subject. So no, there could be, but there would have to be an agreement, and the people could leave there. And the people who had weapons, they just couldn't take their weapons. So it could be devised if both sides decided, hey, no, look, we don't want all this fighting and killing. It's not going to serve any purpose, which it won't. You could just say, well, let the people who want to leave, and but then they would have to accept the position that Idlib is part of Syria, which is what I think would be the proper position to hold.
Just a year ago, the American Special Envoy for the Anti-ISIL Coalition, Brett McGurk, referred to Idlib as the biggest al-Qaeda haven since 9/11. We can have a listen together to that.
Look, Idlib province is the largest al-Qaeda safe haven since 9/11. And Idlib now is a huge problem. It is an al-Qaeda safe haven right on the border of Turkey.
Well, Washington's rhetoric regarding Idlib does seem to have changed since then. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think since that report, maybe our position hasn't changed too much, but the evidence is out that we are playing too many games with al-Qaeda, because we've used al-Qaeda as the excuse for being there, and yet I don't believe that is the case. I think we're there for other reasons, and al-Qaeda it's a haven there, and we're on their side. I mean, the pragmatic reason for this is that we think al-Qaeda will help our position, the United States position, to get rid of Assad. And this is a bipartisan Republican and Democratic position. It's only individuals like ourselves in the Institute for Peace and Prosperity that are arguing this is totally unnecessary. It's not the right position. It isn't what the United States should be doing. It's not part of our Constitution. And yet it drives us to align ourselves with al-Qaeda. So the fact that they admitted it was more of an alert to those individuals that they had to overcome that image, because we're supposed to be over there fighting them. But this isn't the first time that the evidence is very clear that we have aligned ourselves with al-Qaeda when we think it's temporarily a benefit to our foreign policy.
One of the solutions proposed by the UN Special Envoy, just looking through it here, was to move the terrorists from Idlib to other areas. Does that sound like a reasonable solution to you?
Well, if you had a miracle maker, maybe it would be.
Right.
Yeah, you could, but I wouldn't think that's going to work. It's not going to work, because you'd have to. They're not going to walk away, you know, and you'd have to remove them by force, and that means there would be a conflict. So no, that's not going to be a solution. I am concerned about the chance to offer civilians who aren't engaged in this, who aren't necessarily part of al-Qaeda, would just like to be left alone and not engaged in this war. If they themselves wanted to leave, I would think that it could be worked out. But right now, I don't think the motives are strong enough to allow that to happen on both sides. Neither one wants that to happen. But to think that the terrorists are going to automatically be removed, if you're going to remove them, that would mean force. It wouldn't work.
As this situation is developing in Idlib, we are hearing threats and warnings coming from Washington towards the Syrian government. Is that going to help in any way?
No, it makes everything worse, because you know, that's our policy. We are threatening people too often. If people don't do what we want and obey us, then we put sanctions on them. And to me, that is the same as a war effort when you do this. So no, I think the threats are terrible. I think the sanctions are terrible, just on principle. But if our government and our people decided that we were going to go to war and there was a declaration of war, you know, blockades and things, and disrupting trade. That's that's a good idea strategically. But just to throw our weight around and put on these sanctions and threaten people, because we are powerful, we have a lot of wealth, and we have the reserve currency of the world, and we have the economic clout to put on sanctions, which I think is a detriment to us. And I think that we shouldn't do that. And long term, it's going to be detrimental to the United States because it's very costly and it's undermining our alliances with anybody that we want to work with, because people are getting tired of us throwing our weight around and putting on sanctions and believing that everybody has to do exactly as we say. But the position for our institute is that we ought to come home and mind our own business and try to set a good example for the world rather than thinking that we own the world, because many of us believe that what we're doing is trying to maintain a modern day empire, and that requires a lot of force, and it requires a lot of lying too, to misinform people in order for the American people to go along with it. But I don't think the American people are well informed on this issue, and that's why they tolerate it. And when they finally wake up, sometimes it's a little late. So what I'm trying to do with our institute is to alert people to the danger that is involved with our foreign policy.
Just on a related topic, what strategy in Syria do you think would be in the U.S. national interest, therefore?
Well, I think the most important thing would be something that Trump said, a few months ago. He evidently didn't really believe it because it didn't last too long, and he changed his mind. And that is, it's time we left Syria. We need to get out of Syria. Our interests are not served by being there. So I would have never gone in a military sense, and I would leave as soon as possible. And I think that is the position that we should have. But the president has changed his tune now. Matter of fact, he's accelerating the interference, but I think this has a lot to do with making sure that we're on the side who will remain very anti-Iran. And that puts us into a situation where we have to be anti-Russia too. And to me, that is very dangerous.
We start this evening with the downing of a Russian military plane just outside of Syria's Latakia, which took the lives of 15 Russian service members. Russian President Vladimir Putin has responded, calling it a chain of tragic circumstances. RT's Yulia Shapovalova has the latest.
The Russian Defense Ministry has said Israel is to blame for the downing of a Russian military plane off the coast of Syria. It claims the Israeli Air Force used the Il-20 as cover for airstrikes from Syrian air defenses. Syrian missiles in turn hit the Russian plane. 15 crew members died as a result. 4 Israeli fighter jets had been targeting Syrian facilities in Latakia province at the time.
On the 17th of September at around 10 p.m, 4 Israeli fighter jets launched guided bombs on Syrian military facilities near the city of Latakia. The bombing occurred in the immediate vicinity of where the Russian Il-20 was coming into land. The Israeli jets deliberately created a dangerous situation. The Israeli pilots used the Russian plane as cover against the Syrian air defense systems. As a result, the Russian Il-20 was brought down by a Syrian air defense missile. There's no way the Israeli pilots could not have seen the Russian plane.
The incident took place above the Mediterranean Sea, 35 kilometers off the Syrian coast. The Russian jet was returning to the Khmeimim airbase. This Il-20 patrol aircraft is known by NATO as the Kut. It has a top speed of 675 kilometers per hour and has a wingspan of around 37 meters. Renowned for its durability, the Il-20 has been in service since the Soviet Union. Israel has confirmed strikes on Syrian territory and regretted the death of the Russians. But it insists Syria, Iran and the armed group Hezbollah are to blame for the downing of the jet. Vladimir Putin added that the incident was the consequence of a tragic chain of events.
Our position on this incident was presented in a Ministry of Defense statement, which was fully coordinated with me. About our response, first, we will use all our forces to provide even more security for the Russian military in Syria, and this will cover all other measures.
The Israeli and Russian presidents spoke on the phone and extended their condolences to the families of the plane's crew. Meanwhile, Russia's foreign ministry summoned the Israeli deputy ambassador over the incident. She stayed there about half an hour and refused to comment on the exit. Some of the remains of the crew, along with personal belongings, have been located in the Mediterranean Sea, where the Il-20 came down. The search and rescue operation is still underway. Yulia Shapovalova, RT.
For more, we're joined by Philip Giraldi, former CIA officer and counterterrorism specialist. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
It was a Syrian air defense that brought down the military plane, but the Russian Defense Ministry blames Israel. Why is that?
Well, I think the explanation by the defense minister was pretty clear. The Israelis were using the Russian plane, which they knew was there, as cover for their own advance to strike targets in Syria. And I think what they were expecting was that with the Russian plane in the air, the Syrian air defenses would not fire and would not obviously threaten the Israeli airplanes. And I think that was their thinking. But unfortunately, as in many cases, something always goes wrong. And in this case, whether the transponder on the Russian plane was turned off or not, the Syrians obviously responded to the Israeli jets, and this is what happens.
Well, how will Russian-Israeli ties suffer from this incident?
Well, I think that that President Putin, in spite of his conciliatory language, has to do something. I think that the Israelis, having staged more than 200 air attacks on Syria, a country with which it's not at war, threatens the Russian presence in the country. So I think there has to be some kind of quid pro quo that will have to be worked out between the two defense ministries to make sure this does not happen again.
Do you feel like that working out will be something that they can do diplomatically, or something that will require more of a military presence or military action?
I think probably it is something that will be done diplomatically, and more than that, at the level of heads of government. That means Mr. Putin and Netanyahu will probably be discussing this issue in some detail.
Well, it's interesting because President Putin says the downing was tragic and accidental, the words you use, and it indicates that leaders want to de-escalate the tensions between the two. Do you agree with this?
Well, I think that unless the Russians want to continue to be a target of Israeli attacks, I think they have to work out some kind of mechanism that stops this from happening. Clearly, the hotline that they had established did not work. The Israelis called only 1 minute before the attack, and obviously the airplane was already in target range of the Syrian air defenses. So it was not a good system. Something better has to be worked out. I think that both Putin and Netanyahu will find it in their interest to do so.
Well, exactly. And Putin added that Moscow will boost security and defenses in Syria. Those would be the steps that everyone will notice. What do you think those specific steps would look like on the ground?
Well, I think President Putin would be well advised, and I'm sure he's already doing this, to upgrade air defenses, the specific mobile units that could be deployed more around the Russian base and also around where Russian units are operating. And if the Israelis dare to make an attack by air, I think the order will be given to shoot them down.
Philip, thank you for joining us, and I'm sure this story will continue to develop. The United States Air Force is calling for more squadrons to prepare for possible war against China and Russia. RT correspondent Dan Cohen has the story.
On Monday, Air Force Secretary Heather Wilson called for a total of 386 squadrons by the year 2030, up from the 312 operating today. The proposal was prepared to meet the demands of the National Defense Strategy the Pentagon unveiled in January. Wilson spoke about the proposal at the Air Force's Air, Space, and Cyber Conference in Washington, D.C. on Monday.
We must see the world as it is. That is why the National Defense Strategy explicitly recognizes that we have returned to an era of great power competition. We must prepare.
The 24% increase would prepare the Air Force for a possible conflict with major powers China and Russia, both of which have recently conducted large-scale military exercises. 300,000 Russian troops took part in its biggest ever war games. China also sent 3,200 troops, indicating a burgeoning military alliance between the two countries. If the United States government approves the Air Force's demands, we would see intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance squadrons increase from 40 to 62 between 2025 and 2030. Tanker squadrons, which allow warplanes to refuel in midair, would go from 40 to 54, and fighter squadrons would go from 55 to 62. Additionally, space squadrons would grow from 16 to 23. The taxpayer bill for such a hike would be a whopping $49.9 billion and an additional $13 billion per year in operating costs. But a 2017 Rand Corporation report says that, quote, U.S. forces could, under plausible assumptions, lose the next war they're called upon to fight, despite the United States outspending China military forces by a ratio of 2.7 to 1 and Russia by 6 to 1. So an increase in military spending doesn't necessarily translate to the battlefield dominance the U.S. envisions. Reporting in Washington, Dan Cohen, RT.
Russia's defense ministry earlier on saying that the Israeli military holds full responsibility for the downing of that Russian military aircraft in Syria earlier this week that killed all 15 servicemen on board. In a statement to the media, the Russian military presented a detailed timeline of the incident, concluding that the actions of the Israeli Air Force did lead to the tragedy. Israel had previously blamed the downing on Syria, Iran and Hezbollah. Our senior correspondent Murad Gazdiev next looks at how it could affect relations forthcoming between Russia and Israel, especially considering their previous history.
Whatever side you ask, no one's guilty, culpable or liable. Everyone blames someone else.
Israel holds the Assad regime, whose military shot down the Russian plane, fully responsible for this incident. Israel also holds Iran and the Hezbollah terrorist organization accountable for this unfortunate incident.
This regrettable incident is the result of the usual Israeli impudence and rowdiness, who always use the filthiest means to achieve their unsavory goals and enact their hostility in our region.
Was it the Syrians who launched the missile while fending off a surprise air raid on their country? Was it the Iranians, Hezbollah, who apparently had an arms factory that just had to be bombed? Or was it the Israelis who reportedly hid behind Russian aircraft?
The presented objective data testify that the actions of Israeli fighter pilots, which led to the loss of life of 15 Russian servicemen, either lack professionalism or were an act of criminal negligence, to say the least.
Russia holds Israel responsible. That is clear. And Israel's excuses have been dismissed as just that, excuses.
The Israeli regime put the Russian servicemen at risk intentionally in order to be able to carry out this attack on Syria, which is, of course, illegal in itself. The arrogance of Netanyahu has caused him great difficulty now because he has to be answerable to the Russian people. And instead of apologizing, as usual, the Israelis are looking for scapegoats.
Israel insists it had to bomb the Iranians, Hezbollah, there and then. Yet, how many times has Israel now had to bomb Syria? Dozens and dozens, monthly, to stop Iranian and Shia aggression, it says. How many times has Iran attacked Israel? And this puts Russia in a tough spot. Its trademark selling point of being friends with everyone may be impossible to keep up.
Russia is now quite even-handed in the Middle East, and it tries to keep good relations with all the parties, with Israel, with the Arabs, with the Palestinians, with Turkey, with Iran. I wonder how long will it last that you can be a friend of everybody, because by the end of the day, we are dealing with a very fragile reality in the Middle East with very contradicting powers and a lot of atrocity, as we know, and violence.
But Russia thought it could manage. And why not? Look at all it has done for Israel. When Russia flew near the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights, they warned them. 310 times they notified Israel. When Israel bombed Syria, Russia never shot down Israeli jets or missiles, even when they posed a danger to Russian personnel. At Israel's request, Russia tore up a deal to sell Syria S-300 air defense systems, which would have made Israeli air raids much more difficult.
Israel expressed its concerns as soon as the S-300 deal with Syria was signed. Israel concluded that with these new air defense systems, Syria would have been able to cover all of Israel's airspace. That means that Damascus could have shot down Israeli military planes just seconds after takeoff. The Israelis said they could not let that happen. They expressed their alarm and asked Moscow to break the deal. Russia has answered Israel's concerns by first suspending the contract and then withdrawing from it completely and returning $400 million that it had already received from the Syrian government.
Russia helped broker a deal to keep Iranian and Hezbollah forces in Syria away from the Golan Heights, from the Israeli border, at Israel's request. In Golan Heights, the Russian military, at Israel's request, launched a special operation to identify and exhume the remains of Israeli soldiers dead for decades. And Russia got UN troops back to the Golan Heights after 6 years.
At the request of Israel, with the assistance of the Russian force, all Iran-backed formations with heavy weapons were withdrawn from the Golan Heights to a safe distance for Israel, more than 140 kilometers to the east of Syria. In 2016, at the urgent request of the Chief of the General Staff of the Israel Defense Forces, Israel received the Magach 3 tank, captured in 1982 in Lebanon and kept in Russia ever since.
And then there's the diplomatic cover Russia's given Israel by backing it up in the UN Security Council or by protecting Israel from Obama's parting shots.
Russia has been helping Israel a lot. Moscow has always taken Israeli interest into account, especially when it comes to the Middle East settlement. For example, in 2016, the outgoing Obama administration tried to push the draft resolution on the Israeli-Palestinian settlement at the UN Security Council. That resolution would have adopted artificial circumstances for the settlement, which were unacceptable for Israel. Russia took Israel's concerns into account. And despite then US Secretary of State John Kerry bombarding Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov with requests to vote in favor of it, Russia didn't do it. Moscow helped Israel in that case, so the resolution didn't pass.
You'd have thought Israel would be grateful, or at least appreciate the effort. But 15 Russian servicemen are now dead, killed in the crossfire of Israel's preemptive vendettas, which means one of two things. Either the Israeli government has no care at all for all that Russia has done, or that the Israeli military leads a very separate life.
The director of a think tank that focuses on the Middle East told us earlier it's clear from the timeline now why Moscow is pointing the finger at Israel.
They say it was deliberate that the Israeli pilots chose to take refuge in a plane or around a plane with a large or a much larger footprint on the radar screens, i.e. the IL or the Ilyushin 20. He says that this was deliberate. Now, it's not clear, and I don't think anybody can go as far as determining the intentions of the Israeli pilots, i.e. did they took refuge in this plane so that the Syrians don't shoot, or they took refuge in the plane, in this plane, so that the Syrians, if they shoot, it would be shot down. There is a fine line between the two analogies. This is why he said this is close to criminal negligence, at one end, and great unprofessionalism in one end. So what is happening is that had it not only been for the operation, but also for the actions of the Israeli airplanes and the misleading of regarding the theater of operations, none of this would have happened. So it's clear for Moscow that Israel is to blame. Now, how or where Moscow goes from there is what remains to be seen.
Russia's defence minister has announced a range of moves to secure Syrian airspace and protect Russia's aircraft operating there. The new measures introduced at a briefing on Monday come a week after a Russian military plane was downed over Syria, an incident Moscow has blamed on Israel.
We're sure that the implementation of these measures will cool some hot heads and will keep them from ill-judged moves that could threaten our servicemen. Otherwise, we'll be forced to react according to the situation at the time.
This is going to change things, perhaps radically. But Moscow was clear. Its pilot safety is the overwhelming concern and overshadows everything else. Firstly, Russia will now supply Syria with S-300 air defense systems within 2 weeks. And that in and of itself is huge. These systems are an order of magnitude more powerful with far greater reach than anything Syria had before. This is going to make any Israeli bombing foray into Syria much more problematic. Let's not forget, Russia held off on doing this for years at Israel's request.
I want to underline that in 2013, Russia responded to Israel's request to put on hold its supplies of the S-300 to Syria. That's despite the weaponry being ready for delivery and Syrian military personnel having undergone training. Today, the situation has changed, and that is not our fault.
Secondly, Syrian air defense command centers will now be equipped with automated fire control systems, which means they'll be able to unify their entire country's air defense network, fire faster, more accurately, and above all else, these systems come with a friend or foe identification subsystem, hopefully preventing any more friendly fire incidents. Thirdly, any object, be it a missile or a jet, attacking Syria from the Mediterranean will be jammed. Its satellite navigation systems, radar, military communications, which Moscow hopes will cool hot heads and help avoid another incident like this. Syrian President Assad has been made aware of these steps. Him and Vladimir Putin had a phone conversation, and the Russian leader said he's ready to intensify efforts to improve the situation and to restore Syria's sovereignty. Putin's spokesperson also stressed that these steps are not targeted at any specific country, but rather wholly and entirely are about ensuring the safety and security of Russian pilots. Just to recap, a Russian Il-20 aircraft was patrolling on Syria's coast when 4 Israeli F-16 jets showed up. They warned the Russians of what they were doing just 1 minute before they launched their airstrike on Syria. 1 minute. Not enough time to get clear of the area. And as icing on the cake, they then took cover, concluded the Russian military, behind this Il-20 aircraft, setting it up as a target for Syrian air defense missiles, purposefully. So, as the Russians said, certain steps are now having to be taken. The situation in Syria has changed again, and not because of Moscow's actions.
Murad Gaziev reporting there. Well, let's discuss this further now and cross live to Peter Ford. He's a former British ambassador to Syria, and you're very welcome, Peter. Firstly, what's your reaction then to this deployment? I suppose it shouldn't come as any surprise.
No, after what happened, Russia was bound to react, if only to preserve its dignity and also some deterrence against possible future incidents like that. What's happened now is a severe blow to Israel. The supply of this S-300 system to Syria is going to constrain Israel's capabilities in the air for possible attacks on Syria, going to constrain them very, very considerably. Russia has been holding off on these deliveries since 2013, 2014. Why? To give Israel some incentive not to go too far in attacking Syria. But in the last 2 years, Israel has launched more than 200 air attacks on Syria. And very recently, they have become more reckless still, even breaking the taboo about attacking targets in the vicinity of Russian facilities. And this led eventually to the tragedy of the downing of the Russian plane. So Russia has said enough is enough. We have no incentive to carry on being nice to Israel. We're getting nothing out of it. So we will supply Syria with these weapons, which are now long overdue.
And how do you think Israel then will react to this latest development, given the fact it's always been against the deployment of S-300s in Syria? Is there anything it can do?
Probably not. Israel will bluster. Their defense minister is already blustering to the effect that this changes nothing, that the Israelis will continue to attack Iranian and Hezbollah targets in Syria. They will be under pressure to show that they can still do that. The situation may become very tense because the Israelis now have to show that they have some deterrent power, that they're not afraid of these new S-300s. But as the Russian spokesman said, cooler heads should now be encouraged. I think that the military people in Israel, not their political superiors, but the military people will be urging caution and time to absorb this new and for Israel awkward reality.
And you say it's an awkward reality. Presumably that's the case too for America or for France, for example, that's launched missile strikes on Syria too. I mean, they must be reassessing how they perhaps act in Syria also.
Absolutely, and if anything, the greater significance of this development is in relation to possible further Western attacks on Syria. Only a couple of weeks ago, the Western powers of France, Britain and America were actively preparing for very drastic strikes, devastating strikes on Syria under some pretext or other, not even necessarily involving chemical weapons. American spokesmen were saying, even if barrel bombs are used, we're going to stop Syria from advancing. Well, now the Americans and the French and the British have been given pause for thought. It's not only their planes that might be shot down by the S-300s, but also their missiles. And they will not be in a hurry to see Russia give a demonstration of its capacity to shoot down Western missiles.